It started as a dream. A true crime podcast that didn't give you nightmares. A mindful mystery show I always wanted, but couldn't find. A show where you could enjoy episodes over and over again, back to back, with not a single ad blasting you awake. A hyper niche, independent true crime podcast made for people just like me. Chronic insomniacs who, for whatever reason, like true crime to unwind. And now, can you believe it? Here we are, Dead Sleep's 100th episode. And I'm Nancy Miller, here for the 100th time. And it is a sincere pleasure. Thank you to everyone who has listened to and followed the show. Especially thanks to those who have been listening from the very beginning and have stuck with me as this show has evolved and as I've gotten more experience as a lone creator making a podcast. I am extremely pleased and proud of what you and I have accomplished, because it really is us. We are the ones that make this show happen. With your subscriptions, of course, but also with everybody's feedback and comments and response. I put a lot of love into this show, and I don't think I expected to get so much love back, and it means a lot. So, as we touch pillow tonight, here's to another 1,000 episodes. I have so many stories I look forward to sharing with you. And again, if you want to help ensure the success of this podcast, it doesn't all fall on your shoulders. So don't worry. There are a lot of people out there who are very generous and kind. But if you can afford it, great. You can subscribe for $5 on Patreon, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Now, if I haven't bored you to death with all that, here's a little something about tonight's episode. Because I've chosen it for my 100th episode for a really particular reason. It's a story that's really important to me. Because it's a saga that changed the course of my career. In 2009, I was a senior editor at Wired magazine, and my beat was largely culture, technology, a bit of science. But I happened upon an article in Los Angeles magazine. And this story, well, it started with the shocking discovery of 3 bodies in a mansion in Los Angeles. It was a story about jealousy, greed, and garlic sauce. A famous story we now call the Zankou chicken murders, but trust me, in the hands of a writer named Mark Arax, I was thunderstruck by the scale, the scope of what was supposed to be just a true crime story. And that's when I realized that true crime can be more than just a litany of terrible things that happen to unlucky people. True crime can be an exploration of all of the difficult things, the complicated things that make us human. An opportunity to inhabit the lives, understand the conflicts of people and places we might never know, and gain a better understanding by seeing something from a different perspective. From the point of view of the victim often, but also from the investigator, from the bystander, from the family members to the perpetrator even. And when I read that article, I thought, I want to create stories like this. And while it took some time, I did end up becoming deputy editor at Los Angeles magazine, where I did help create stories like that, working alongside and learning from some of the best editors and writers in the true crime genre. And part of what this show aspires to do is to bring attention to many of those writers and editors. Now, this story, it's been told and retold in any number of podcasts. Everyone refers to it as the Zankou chicken murders, which is an unfortunate shorthand. Because not only does it take away from the actual people this happened to, it doesn't do justice to the reporting of the person who first wrote about this case, Mark Arax, back in LA Mag in 2009. And even over the many iterations over the years, people tend to miss one really important detail. A detail I didn't even know when I read the article back in 2009. That the writer, that's Mark Arax, he himself, while working on this story, was grappling with a murder mystery of his own. The long unsolved homicide of his own father when Mark was just 15 years old. And he would spend nearly 30 years trying to figure out who killed his father and why. And Mark's lifelong compulsion for answers would ultimately lead him to a career in journalism. And while he makes no mention of it in the original article about this case, it's one of the reasons why his story was so good, is because he is thorough in investigating what happened with this family. What led to murder? It's a question that burned in his own mind, in his own life, for years. Until one day, out of nowhere, he got his answer. And you'll hear more about that later in the episode. So for this 100th episode of Dead Sleep, we have a murder mystery wrapped inside a true crime saga, gently folded inside a bedtime story, with all kinds of extraneous and exhausting details to fatigue our busy minds. And so in this Dead Sleep version of events, our story begins, well, I'll tell you where it doesn't begin. It doesn't begin that terrible day in January of 2003, when 3 people were found shot dead in a mansion in Glendale, California. Because the so-called Zankou chicken murders, it all started as a love story. A case of unrequited love, harbored by a teenage girl named Rita. And her crush was the boy who lived in the building next door. The two separated by a narrow little alley. She liked this boy from the first moment she even remembered liking boys, age 12. And that crush endured. It actually grew stronger, her longing more potent, the desire more great. Year after year after year, watching this older boy become a man. He was a bad boy, of course, roaring through the streets in his banana yellow Oldsmobile. An American muscle car he rode like a chariot of fire, which was perfect for the golden boy living in the golden age of Beirut, Lebanon. All the way back in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, Beirut was known as the Paris of the Middle East. With a thriving art scene and fashionable cafe society, inspired in part from Lebanon's decades-long social, political, and cultural ties with France after the fall of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. The Ottoman Empire once encompassed a vast territory across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, including Turkey, Greece, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and a small, landlocked nation just east of Turkey called Armenia. Over the decades, Beirut became a popular vacation hub for people all over the world, a destination for celebrities like Brigitte Bardot and Egyptian movie star Omar Sharif. People from all backgrounds came to Beirut, who would dance and drink and smoke the night away in the city's myriad jazz clubs and tucked away spots that were open all night long. There to serve the hungry crowd in that golden age was the chicken shop that laid the golden eggs. Zankou Chicken. The Zankou Chicken storefront, it was tiny, and there were no tables, barely anywhere to stand. And yet it kept a brisk business. What made Zankou so popular was the perfectly salted and seasoned chickens, hand-turned on a spit until each fresh, whole chicken was roasted to a juicy golden brown. And that's what made Zankou good. But what made it outstanding was their literal special sauce, a fluffy garlic sauce, a recipe likely passed down through generations, but perfected by Mirdiris's mother, Margaret. This tasty garlic paste, which you could slather on just about anything, was the magic ingredient. The thing that kept these customers coming back again and again and again. Zankou was a family business, but at the center of it all was the golden boy, Medeiros. Medeiros was the oldest boy in his family and a playboy around Beirut. Medeiros was like an Armenian James Dean, with the swagger of a young Dean Martin, back when he was known as the King of Cool. Medeiros with his slick back hair, wearing the finest suits from a French designer named Pierre Cardin. Everywhere he went, a whirl of cologne trailed behind him, with any number of female admirers picking up his scent. Rita knew all of this because she could see Medeiros entertain from her balcony, which was directly across from his balcony. And eventually, Medeiros finally took notice of Rita, who'd gone from a 12-year-old girl with a crush to a statuesque 19-year-old with big brown eyes and long curly brown hair. And the two began a clandestine correspondence. Flirtatious notes passed back and forth, tucked inside one of Medeiros' many empty cologne bottles. To Rita, the possibility of their union was as distant as a message in a bottle thrown out into the sea. Her parents would never agree to it. Rita and Medeiros snuck around together until one day, Rita was spotted by one of her nosy neighbors, whooshing by in one of Medeiros' muscle cars. And that neighbor told Rita's parents. Rita's parents were inclined to break up the match, except, well, it was obvious. The two were actually in love. And technically, Rita was now an adult, 19 years old. Medeiros, 26, and finally ready to settle down and start a family. Rita and Medeiros were married in the early 1970s, a moment of calm just before the storm. A long-brewing civil war in Lebanon finally erupted in the 1970s. And this civil war disrupted the lives of everyone living in the country. And this unrest was particularly vexing for a sizable community of Armenian Christians who called the country home, since they were driven out of their native land back in 1915, during a period of violence, forced deportation, starvation, and bloodshed, with anywhere from 600,000 to over 1 million Armenians losing their lives in what is now commonly recognized as the Armenian Genocide. Medeiros and his family didn't want to leave Beirut. Their Zankou chicken business was a gold mine. The family's fortune in Zankou chicken was just like the Zankou River in Armenia. The restaurant was named after. Money flowed from the restaurant into lucrative real estate deals with rental properties all around Beirut. The restaurant, it was a cash business, one that Medeiros' father could still somehow manage despite his habit of disappearing for days on alcohol-fueled benders. Medeiros' mother, Margaret, she worked enough for 3 people, never mind her husband, and some wondered if maybe she worked so maniacally to keep her mind off of the shame her husband brought to their family. And when her husband eventually sobered up, her industriousness would make him feel guilty. Whether Margaret knew it or not, no one knew how to wield guilt like a weapon better than she. And it seemed her techniques were most effective on her son, Medeiros. Rita would later recall how Medeiros was more devoted to his mother than he was to his wife. His mother called him the prince, and she was his queen. His mother, she was only second to God, Rita once said. And it seemed Margaret desired more than love. She demanded allegiance. And Medeiros spoke often of how he and Rita would always make sure his mother was taken care of, that she would always live with them, no matter what, no matter where. Rita honored the tradition, but she struggled with her mother-in-law's control of her husband and her iron grip on the entire Zankou chicken enterprise. The vision of Zankou chicken, it may have started with Medeiros' father, but the heart and soul, the sauce, that was all Margaret. And moving out of Beirut, well, it would happen over her dead body. Only it would be her son Medeiros, who was actually the one who was in danger. By the mid-1970s, Beirut had gone from Paris of the Middle East to a volatile war zone. The swinging sound of jazz bursting out of nightclubs, now replaced by the furious staccato of gunfire on every street corner. And disputes that might have been resolved in a court were now taken to the streets, fought to the death. The family wasn't affected by it directly. That is until one day in 1979, when Medeiros sat a block away from Zankou chicken and a motorcycle buzzed by, circled around, then raced back around. Nobody recognized the men on the motorcycle. They wore black masks pulled up high on their faces. But there was one unmistakable detail. One of them held the brown and black body of an automat Kalashnikova, better known as an AK-47. The Russian assault rifle designed back in 1947. Widely available, hard to trace, and so easy to use, you could fire an AK-47 with one hand. And the one aimed at Medeiros, that AK-47 was automatic, raining bullets down on Medeiros in a fiery hail. One after another, after another, after another, 16 shots in all. Then the masked men peeled off, leaving Medeiros bleeding on the street. Medeiros would survive and make a full physical recovery, but the experience made him more than a little paranoid. Medeiros would find out that this attempted murder, it was over some relatively low-level real estate deal, but one of the shooters was politically connected, and Medeiros had no idea if this person would try again. After that day, he made a habit of tucking a gun or two into the waistband of his trousers before leaving the house. So between the full-scale civil war and Medeiros' enemies, it was time to leave Lebanon. The golden boy Medeiros was now headed to the Golden State, his bride Rita, his mother Margaret, and the rest of the family in tow. And the prince assured his mother, the queen, that he would make them all so successful they would live in a castle. And this was true. For Medeiros, California would turn out to be the land of unimaginable riches and the fertile ground for unspeakable betrayal. January 2nd, 1972. As Medeiros sped in his muscle car throughout the streets of Beirut, there was another Armenian free spirit, himself the son of a refugee, forced to flee from Armenia to America to escape the senseless mass murder of his people and build a new life for himself and his son, Ara. At 40 years old, Ara was no playboy. He was a husband and father of 3 kids who worked long hours as the owner of a local bar in Fresno, California. In Fresno, it was a lot of things, but it was no Paris of the Middle East. A 4-hour drive from LA, Fresno was known for its agriculture, the raisin capital of the world. But back in the 1970s, it was the local economy that had shriveled up. Ara's family grocery store destroyed when the supermarket chain Safeway came to town. Ara took whatever money the family had and bought a bar. Ara's bar was a rock and roll club, and the only thing Ara loved more than rock and roll was baseball. And the only thing Ara loved more than baseball was his eldest son, Mark, a scrawny, dark-eyed, dark-haired 15-year-old. And it was just one day after the new year, January 2nd, what was supposed to be Ara's day off. But later that day, he received an unexpected phone call, and he had to go in to tend to some business. Mark was supposed to go with his father to the club that day, but while he was in the shower, his father, Ara, told him to stay home. It was chilly out. He didn't want Mark to catch a cold, leaving the house with that wet hair. His father said he'd be back in an hour. An hour passed. Mark would later wonder, when the phone rang, if he sensed anything, something bad or ominous. If he was being honest, he wasn't worried any more than usual. Ever since his dad opened the bar, his father had complained about a few things. The professional customers had gone away, and in their place was a rougher crowd. Bikers and druggies drawn to this rock and roll club in Fresno as a party oasis in an otherwise quiet and desolate part of California. They came for the live music, the hard drugs, and the solicitous women. But recently, Mark's father was losing patience with this unsavory crowd. He was getting into it with customers, yelling at his own staff. Things were tense at times, but never violent, ever. So that phone call, then his mother's scream, and Mark immediately thought, car accident. It was foggy that early evening when his father left, a dense gray atmosphere that made everything ordinary appear darker, more mysterious. And Mark would later connect the fog of that night with the heavy shadow that loomed over his father's death. The only thing Mark would know, really know, about what happened that night was what his mother said. What she screamed, again and again. Your father. He's been shot. Hearing the news, Mark fled the house. His wails so primal, a neighbor ran out thinking a dog had been struck by a car. Mark and his family rushed to the hospital, where they'd learned his father was shot by 2 different guns, hit at least 5 times. When Mark's father arrived, he was conscious enough to joke that if they could save his life, he'd buy everyone in the hospital around at his bar. But no amount of free bourbon could stop Ara's body from losing all that blood. Within 90 minutes of his arrival, Mark Arax died at the hospital. If Ara knew who did this to him and why, he took those names to his grave. Even back then, as a teenager, Mark sensed Fresno homicide wouldn't be able to solve this case. Fresno wasn't LA, for starters. But even the most advanced forensic techniques, which back in 1972 involved sprinkling black graphite powder, using a small, delicate camel hair brush to dust for fingerprints. Even that would be next to hopeless in a case like this. Ara's, it was a down and dirty dive bar, and it was still recovering from New Year's Eve, the busiest night of the year. On a good day, it would never pass a white glove test, but there were likely thousands of sticky fingerprints on every ashtray and pool cue. Even the beer mugs were likely cleaned and dried with a towel touched more times than the robes of Jesus himself. Solving this case would take a miracle. But there was one witness, the bartender, and she'd tell her version of events over and over again, a story that would never change. It was 6:30 p.m. She was at the bar. Ara was in the office. 2 men walked in. Did she know them? No, but she could tell they weren't the usual Fresno crowd. They were city slicker types, it seems, cosplaying cowboy, in fringe jackets that were in fashion at that time, like John Voight in Midnight Cowboy. They didn't look like druggies, drifters, or thieves. They looked more like Hollywood actors playing a part, like Paul Newman and Robert Redford, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, ambling in and ordering 2 draft beers before heading to the pool table to shoot some stick. Had it not been the day after New Year's, where hangovers and resolutions kept people at home, it might have been happy hour. But they were the only 2 customers there. She remembered the men drank 2 beers, hung out a little, then left. And then they came back. This time they didn't head for the bar, where the cash register was. They made their way towards the back, where Ara sat in his office, figuring out the quarterly taxes, laying down receipt after receipt, the world's most dreary game of solitaire. And that's when the guns came out. There was no warning, no stick 'em up. But all of a sudden, it was whammo, blam, pow, pop, pop, pew. The exact sound those guns made, a kid like Mark could only guess. From whatever sound you might imagine if you were a kid in the early 1970s. If you were a kid lucky enough to only know the sound of gunfire from comic books, from watching Batman and Robin, from falling asleep to boring old westerns on TV when there was nothing else on. If you were a kid, like Mark, to only know violence and murder as entertainment. Until that day, January 2nd, 1972. Of course, after that, everything changed. Mark changed. From a regular kid to a warrior on a quest, an avenger who vowed to find his father's killers. The night his father died, Mark and his 2 younger siblings curled up next to their mother as she sobbed in bed. And it was there, as he could feel his mom's body shaking. Mark understood. He was the eldest son of Arax, and it was now up to him. Like Zanku, the name Arax, it's also a river in Armenia, the one that separates Armenia from Turkey. At over 1,000 kilometers long, that's 666 miles. The Arax River is one of the biggest in the region, covering over 39,000 square miles. A grim metaphor for the death of Arax, the man. His murder would be infamous as the longest, most high-profile, unsolved homicide case in Fresno history. A cold-blooded murder like this was rare in Fresno, and the detectives working the case at that time theorized it had to be a professional job. The two men were indeed playing a part. As regular customers, two fellas just coming in for a beer. But who they really were a pair of hitmen coming there to get a job done. The murder of Arax. When the police asked their sole witness, that bartender, for physical descriptions, she only really remembered one face. Probably the one face she liked the best. The Redford one. The Sundance Kid. The guy with the pushback blonde hair, high cheekbones and a tidy mustache, a knowing gleam in his eye. That would be the face seared into Mark's memory. One he'd searched for everywhere he went, a face Mark swore he once saw at a pizza parlor, a man he followed to his car, furtively writing down the license plate, then calling the police. His mother begged him to stop, and soon enough, Mark realized, walking around playing amateur detective, it wasn't going to be enough. And it wasn't just Mark who was suspicious. Everyone in Fresno wondered what Ara was up to. Nobody would be shot in their own bar by two hitmen unless he'd been up to something bad. So not only was Mark fighting to find his father's killers, he was also fighting for the family's reputation, for his father's name. He knew he'd need to be strong, inside and out. And like some old kung fu movie, he developed a steely discipline, lifting weights until his body shook. Focusing on the man who killed his father, the face of the man in the police sketch coming to life in his mind. The day would come, likely very soon, when Mark would see the face of that killer, somewhere on the street, maybe down a dark alley. And that man, both men, those killers, they would see that the murder of his father only made Mark stronger. And in time, Mark would grow up to look exactly like him. And they would see his father in his face, and the fury in his eyes. And they would feel the terror his father felt. And they would pay. In the meantime, Mark would become a professional searcher of truth, working for the LA Times in Fresno as an investigative journalist, the pen being mightier than the sword and all that. But all that work, it was just the warm-up, the side hustle. The real job was to find his father's killers. And throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Mark began to believe his father's death was complicated, that his father's death was part of something much bigger. And there was a reason it hadn't been solved, that it was tied to all manner of government corruption happening at the very top of Fresno, from the mayor to the police. Who knew how far this thing went? His pursuit of the truth was a lot like those grapevines in Fresno. If you dig deep enough. It seemed he believed that finding the truth would be like those grapevines in Fresno. That if he toiled hard enough, if he dug deep enough, if he did everything right under the perfect conditions, the fruits of his labor would be the truth. But truth, it can't be cultivated. It reveals itself in its own time. And over the next 28 years, as Mark won awards for his reporting, finding justice for so many others, he simply couldn't solve what happened to his father. Then, just like that night in 1972, another phone call, out of the blue, this one from Fresno police. Yes, it'd been 30 years, but they were happy to say, they were confident, they'd solved the murder of Mark Arax. Mark took in the details. A long story from a long time ago, but the gist of it was this. There was no grand conspiracy. The two men that killed his father were career criminals who came to California by way of Detroit. And somehow they crossed paths with two shady characters, a couple of barflies, one of whom was there New Year's Eve, a woman who said she knew for a fact that Arax was busy that night, and there was at least $5,000 between the cash register and the safe, and they hadn't meant to kill Arax. They only meant to scare him, point a gun at him to keep him still. Instead, that gun, it triggered a reaction in Arax, and he rushed at the men, fighting them off, until one of the men said he shot in almost self-defense. The reason why they didn't rob the cash register was that they ran out of time. They panicked. And that's what this was. A hasty, poorly planned, poorly executed robbery with a murder that happened in a blind panic. And they found this out because it was the getaway driver, now an old man, who'd been picked up on some drug charge and needed to get it off his chest. And he, along with the woman, received immunity in exchange for information about the two gunmen. And it turned out one of the gunmen, he died years ago, back in 1982. And the one guy left, he was already in prison. And now that the truth about this case had been exposed, he wouldn't be getting out anytime soon. There was a part of Mark that wanted his father's death to be complicated. The journalist in Mark respected the truth. But the boy who'd lost his father struggled to believe it. That he saw his father as smart, powerful, and important, a hero. And in the movies, a man's courage is what saves the day, not the thing that got you killed. In Mark's darkest moments, he even saw his father as an accomplice to his own murder. Why hadn't he stayed still? And maybe that's why Mark Arax was compelled to cover the Zankou chicken murders. In some ways, the cases were similar. There were similarities. Murder cases with Armenian families at the center. But in another way, the Zankou chicken murders, they were the opposite of what happened to his father. Not a split-second mistake, but a slow-building disaster, 25 years in the making. It was around the year 2000, roughly the same time that Mark was finding out the truth about his father's death, that Medeiros was finding out the truth about his life, that he didn't have very long. The very same body that had survived 16 bullets back in 1979 was now riddled with cancer. And Medeiros, he told his wife Rita he would fight it. But the truth was, he wouldn't be the one to bring Zankou chicken into the 21st century. though he'd done one hell of a job so far. Everyone in LA knew Zanku, and there were several locations across the county. And this enterprise, it had not been easy. When Medeiros and his family arrived in LA, his mother and father wanted nothing to do with the restaurant business. They wanted to sock away the fortune they'd made back in Lebanon and keep things simple by opening a dry cleaning business. Regular hours, a reliable business, and for once they'd be cleaning other people's clothes and not having their own clothes smell like garlic. Always the pungent smell of garlic that got into every nook and cranny, from your clothes to your car to your closet. But Medeiros prevailed, assuring his father, mother, sisters, and the rest of the family that he was right. And with this decision, to essentially lead the entire family into the future of the business, Medeiros went from the pampered prince to the family patriarch. Throughout the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, Medeiros took care of everyone. And yet, he wasn't the king. Not as long as his mother, the queen, was still alive. Both mother and father lived with Medeiros and Rita and their 4 children in a giant mansion with live-in servants up in the hills. When Medeiros' father passed away, Medeiros made sure that his mother knew she was always the queen, and she was treated as such. If Medeiros, Rita, and Margaret were in the car together, it was Medeiros' mother, Margaret, who enjoyed the front seat. Rita always sat in the back. Margaret enjoyed work-life balance to the extremes. Margaret had her own tailor, who made for her the finest silk clothing. At the same time, she'd still show up to work at Zanku every morning, putting an apron on those fine silk clothes to begin her day making her famous garlic paste, the secret to Zanku's success. Everyone knew Medeiros Iskandarian was more than a man. He was a myth, a legend. But how he became a murderer, that's something people still struggle to understand. When Medeiros realized he was dying, maybe he'd hoped that at long last, people would take care of him. And it seems he assumed that his mother in particular would be there by his side. Sure, she wasn't a warm and fuzzy person. She wasn't one to say, "I love you." But everyone knew that she doted on Medeiros, her prince. So you can imagine his shock when he announced that he had cancer and that it was likely terminal, that his mother treated him like he was already dead. From the day that he shared his cancer news, his mother never asked what kind of cancer, what kind of treatment he was going to have. She didn't ask him anything. In fact, she stopped speaking to him entirely. What's more, it was around this time that Margaret decided to move out of the family home, a place where she'd lived for 25 years, moving in with Medeiros' sister. Margaret had always put a premium on loyalty, and soon after she moved in, Medeiros' sister also stopped speaking to him. At first, Medeiros tried to figure out what was wrong. He assumed it was likely because, well, Medeiros was leaving the business to his 4 sons. This to him made perfect sense. To be fair, Medeiros might have been a prince, but his 4 adult sons, they were fools. Even Rita knew this to be true. The 4 boys had grown up rich and spoiled in Los Angeles, each one of them having their own issues, from drugs to serious run-ins with the law. Maybe it was wishful thinking on Medeiros' part, but he'd hoped, perhaps, that once he was gone, his sons would get serious, and they'd take over the business. He was wild once. Why not? But it seems other family members felt slighted, and their response to feeling slighted was giving Medeiros the silent treatment. And the very thing Medeiros had tried to avoid, that is, infighting, a divided family, bickering about money, feuding over greed. It happened anyway. Throughout their entire marriage, Rita and Medeiros, they kept their marriage and their business separate. Rita had absolutely nothing to do with the restaurant. She devoted herself to raising their children and being a good wife. And later she wished she'd done more to intervene. But at the time, she was on her husband's side. And at a certain point, cancer had ravaged Medeiros' body so badly. He'd lost his hair. He'd lost 60 pounds. He was so weak. All he had left was his pride. And he decided he wasn't going to try and apologize to his mother. For what? And in most families, a silent treatment, maybe it would be a few days. But in this family, it was more than days. It was months, then years. Medeiros was no longer hurt. He was angry. And one of the warning signs, perhaps, that people should have noticed was when Medeiros took a family photo. It was actually him with his mom. He ripped the photo out of the frame, tore it in half, and then he took the half of the photo, the one with his mother, and set it on fire. Then came January 2003. Medeiros had told Rita that he was heading to Zankou to meet with a friend. And in Rita's memory, he wore a white suit, one that she couldn't recall him wearing in years. And in that white suit, he looked less like a man, more like a ghost. What she might have missed were the two guns. One he slid into the waistband of his pants, the other he slid in the suit jacket pocket. And she would soon discover that her husband's last words to her were a lie. He did not go to Zankou to meet with a friend. He went to his sister's house, where his mother now lived. He rang the doorbell. The maid answered. She asked him if he wanted some lemonade. Lemonade being the only thing that, with all the chemo, Medeiros could tolerate. What he and his sister talked about, who knows? But it was all in anticipation of his mother coming home from Zankou, which she did. Carrying an armful of food, she put the food down. The three sat on the sofa. The maid stepped away. It was Medeiros' nephew in the other room who heard the shots. Both his mother and his sister pleading with him in Armenian to let them live. But Medeiros, if he wasn't going to live, it seems neither would they. Within minutes, it was over. Medeiros fatally shot his sister first, then he killed his mother. The coroner would later notice that Medeiros had aimed all of the bullets directly at his mother's heart. Then he sat down on the couch and turned the gun on himself. And later, the old Armenian ladies would say, at least he had the decency to do that. Rita, of course, was shocked, angry, and confused. But she didn't have time to think. She didn't have time to mourn. She knew there was work to do. Even though Rita had never set foot in Zankou chicken in all of those years, The survival of the business relied on her. And in a tragic way, Medeiros did get what he wanted. The tragedy of the murders and his father's suicide did bring the 4 boys together. 4 men who vowed they would never let greed and conflict come between them. And in the years since, that's held true. And Zankou Chicken still remains a successful family business. And every so often, Rita will ask her sons to sit down, and she'll take out a photo album with pictures from the 1960s and 70s, images of Rita and Medeiros in the Golden Age, Paris in the Middle East. And she'd remind them, no matter what's happened, it all started as a love story. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep, and as always, this is just one part of the story. Check out the links in the show notes. I'll be back very soon with an all-new episode. Until then, nighty-night.